Welcome to the second episode of the Campaign School podcast, produced by the Academy of the Impossible. I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with Seb Fox Allen. And this week we're going to talk about the recent Alberta Provincial Election, which seemed to defy the pundits and the pollsters, yet still provides a lot in terms of the power of traditional campaigns and the type of attention that politics in Canada is getting. So I'm curious, Seb, to start things off, what you thought of the results of the Alberta election, and if there was anything in particular that you thought was rather significant.
Well, I definitely think the results surprised virtually everyone in the political community, in the polling community, and certainly Canadians more broadly. I think one of the really interesting things that we've seen come out of the data so far is that voter turnout was quite high in this election. 57% of Albertans showed up to vote on Monday. That's the highest it's been since 1993, and it was much higher than the previous election in 2008, which was only 40%. When we see higher turnouts, we tend to infer that it will benefit non-establishment campaigns, of which the Wild Rose Party would certainly qualify. And I think it tends to suggest momentum or excitement for change. In this case, it didn't seem to be so. If you take the example of Rom Ford, another candidate perceived as sort of the counterculture choice in the 2010 Toronto mayoral race, you'll see that his victory was propelled by exceptional turnout in the GTA, up at 53%. To give an example of what it was in the previous election, it was all the way down at 39.
Well, and it's funny that we look at these numbers as being improvements, which speaks both to the challenge I think electoral politics faces vis-a-vis legitimacy, vis-a-vis getting enough people for the mandate to actually be legitimate in terms of the number of people behind it. But at the same time, I think this also speaks to the problems that polls and pundits are having, because it's clearly a segmented, a very diverse and polarized public, that if you're not talking to the right people, you're clearly not getting a sense of either what popular sentiment is, or in this case, what the final election would be. And I think where the Wild Rose certainly had a lot of attention, in the end, they didn't actually have a lot of electoral support. So I'm curious, Seb, what you think the Wild Rose will do now that they actually are a force in Alberta's legislative assembly, and what kind of role that they're going to play, both provincially, but the main reason we're having this conversation is Alberta plays a prominent role federally. And often politics in Alberta have a strong influence on federal politics. So that really allows someone like Danielle Smith to sort of swing above her weight class. So I'm curious what you think what are your thoughts in terms of what she might be capable of in the months and years to come?
Well, it's been interesting to hear people make arguments on both sides as to whether a Harper government would have preferred a progressive conservative government or a Wild Rose government. I think for the Wild Rose particularly, what they have to look out for over the next 4 years is how they're going to contribute to the legislature. They have several different paths that they can take. I mean, they could either aggressively pressure their progressive conservative colleagues to govern farther to the right than they may be comfortable with. On the other hand, they could take a more obstructionist tone and try and maintain their outside the beltway street cred, so to speak. Or they could take a more cautious approach, work on their infrastructure, work on their campaign, and come back in 2014, with an argument that they paid their dues, they learned the process, and now they're ready to govern.
Well, and it's interesting because both historically and I think even in contemporary times, it takes a long time to become the government, to build a political movement, to build the riding associations and the political machines to be able to achieve that electoral victory. And recently at the Academy of the Impossible, we had NDP Member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park, Peggy Nash, who has both in past been the president of the NDP and recently ran unsuccessfully for the leadership. And she had some really interesting thoughts in terms of what it'll take for the NDP to form the government, both in terms of strategy in Parliament, but also in terms of places like Quebec and places like rural Canada, of the type of work that they need to do to become competitive, to build the type of party infrastructure. I'm curious, Seb, what you thought of her remarks in general and the sort of tone that she set upon her visit.
Well, I think what I was struck by most by her talk, which was very engaging and very interesting, specifically when she was talking about how she became politicized through the labor movements of particularly the airline industry. But what I was struck by the most in her remarks was how confident she seemed to be that the New Democrats had, or at least were developing, a pretty strong argument to govern. I can't remember the last time that I heard a central figure in the New Democratic Party seem to be able to project that much confidence in that kind of assertion.
What's also interesting is that if a senior NDP leader had tried to do that in almost any previous incarnation, they would be laughed at. They certainly wouldn't have the credibility to be considered as the government in waiting, which is often the phrase they're now applying to themselves. And it does speak to how Canadian politics have changed. And I think certainly the Liberal Party, as they now finally start setting the rules for their own leadership contest, are going to perhaps have their own struggle to fit in as the third party, to be able to return to the prominence and profile that they once had, because it certainly seems like the NDP is stealing their win. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on what the Liberals need to do, given the NDP's increasing credibility, to present themselves both as an alternative and both, given the question you asked, that there will be perhaps increasing pressure for both parties to cooperate.
Well, I think the impending leadership contest in the Liberal Party will be a real test for them. And specifically, I'm interested in knowing if someone will run in the same way that Nathan Cullen did, on a platform that involves either cooperation or collusion with the NDP.
That's a great answer. And it speaks, too, about the way in which it may not be up to them, that it may not be up to the party establishments in both the Liberal and NDP, but rather it will be up to the electoral public. It will be up to the types of people who want to vote, who don't want to see the Tories come back into power, and perhaps will speak in the way that strategic voting seemed to play a role in the Alberta election, of people voting for the Progressive Conservatives, even if perhaps they weren't Progressive Conservative supporters, but to stop the Wild Rose, for example, from having more influence than they did. So to be curious if that too will start playing a role vis-a-vis Liberal and NDP political fortunes. This has been fun, and fortunately for this episode, you threw a meme, which we're hoping will be one of the regular features of our podcast, which is partly why we're using YouTube, both so we can have some lulls that go with the podcast, but also so that we can provide a bit of a different analysis than the traditional political punditry. Thanks, Seb.
Thanks, Jesse.